Hi ladies, welcome to your test review podcast for chapter 34. I'm going to be talking about art of the second half of the 20th century up until today. So some of the artists that I'll be talking about are living and working today. They are contemporary artists. So I'm going to try to touch on some of the highlights for your test on Thursday, and I also want to talk about postmodern architecture. I'm going to try to keep this to one podcast. So if there's a couple works that I don't get to, then you can research them on your own. Khan Academy obviously is a wonderful resource, but I will try to get to as much of the works as I can. You are absolutely responsible for all of the required works for this chapter, and I already did give you a bunch of hints about your essay question and the short answer questions that will be on your test on Thursday, but I'll try to give you a couple more hints as we go along in our podcast. So I want to start out with this little slide with the different art movements that are going on during the second half of the 20th century up until today. And there's quite a few of them. So I want you to try to keep them as straight as you possibly can. I know all of these isms are kind of a little out of control, but you just got to bear with me here because we're at the end, guys. The end is in sight. So we began with abstract expressionism, and really the two guys that I talked about were de Kooning and Pollock. So how was their work similar? How was their work different? Hopefully you're remembering our discussion about how the abstract expressionists were interested in color. They were interested in the tactile quality of paint. They were interested in making painterly work, and that word painterly is a good word for you guys to know and to use. And that's just when artists are interested in using paint in a different, more non-traditional way. And de Kooning and Pollock absolutely did that. Pollock especially, with the dripping of the paint, the splashing of the paint, the rolling the canvas on the floor, and creating these completely abstract, large-scale paintings. Whereas de Kooning, he also used paint in a non-traditional way by smearing it, by using a lot of paint and layering the paint. And we talked about how he would often do, a painting of something and then cover it up and then cover it up again and cover it up again. And we looked at his Woman One, which is the required work for this chapter. So he has a little bit more of a representation in his painting, whereas Pollock is completely abstract. We touched on pop art. We all love pop art. Your required pop artists are Andy Warhol. You need to know about his silk screening process. That's really important. And you need to know Claes Oldenburg and his large-scale sculptures. You have two in our backyard at Philadelphia, so you need to be really familiar with Claes Oldenburg as well. Then we talked about Greenbergian formalism. Remember Clement Greenberg and his thoughts on what art should look like and what art should be. And that led us to talk about the color field painters, and we touched on Mark Rothko, who is one of my favorites, and also Helen Frankenthaler and her soak stain paintings. So she's another important artist to know about because she was a woman painter. She was competing with all of these other famous guys like Jackson Pollock and Andy Warhol. And she used the soak stain technique for her paintings. So you need to know about her process as well. For a lot of these artists, the process was equally, if not more important than the completed product. Okay? We didn't talk so much about conceptual art, performance art, op art, so I'm going to skip over them. We touched on minimalism, the focus on the objecthood of a thing, and Maya Lin's Vietnam Veteran Memorial is sort of a fusion of minimalism with site-specific art. So you should be very familiar with that work. We spent a good amount of time talking about it. So why was it controversial? How is it a fusion of text and artwork? Why is it minimalist? Why is it site-specific? Think about all of those things. We also touched on site-specific art, Christo and Jean-Claude, very, very important duo. We touched on the gates. I would really recommend that you review that again, read about it on your own. We also talked about Smithson, Robert Smithson, and his spiral jetty, which is an environmental artwork out in Salt Lake, Utah. So you need to know about him. And then, of course, feminist art. I told you to know at least one feminist artist that you can talk about for your test. Cindy Sherman is a great example. We looked at a whole bunch of her photography. I'm going to talk about Kiki Smith in a minute, so she's another good example. Or you could talk about Praying Mantra by Mutu, which we talked about today in class, actually. And then finally, just to remind you, a lot of artists are taking advantage of new technologies that are coming about in the second half of the 20th century. Video art, computer art, 3D modeling, all of these new technologies are now appearing in a lot of postmodern art. So Bill Viola is a perfect example. We looked at his video art of The Crossing, which is a video installation, and we also looked at Nam June Paik's Electronic Superhighway and his different ways of using television in his artwork. I want to touch on modern architecture, or in this case, postmodern architecture. We have two required works, actually three. The Guggenheim, the house in Newcastle County, and then the Max II National Museum by Zaha Hadid. So I'm going to touch on some of those works, but here are some like common characteristics of postmodern architecture. So as I said in class, a lot of postmodern artists are borrowing from the past and then kind of putting their own spin on it. All right, so I have here historical associations banned. We don't see any pediments. We don't see any columns. We don't see any flying buttresses. Now, that being said, when we look at Zaha Hadid's contemporary museum, the Max II in Rome, you will see some little columns in there, and it actually reminds me a lot of Villa Savoy by Le Corbusier, who we studied in the last chapter. So I'll see if you agree with me. But for the most part, it's kind of out with the old, in with the new, but really just if they are incorporating things from the past, they're putting their own spin on it. That's what you'll see a lot. Also, you'll see natural light supplemented by artificial light. So lots of windows, but also interesting artistic looking lighting inside of the buildings. They are utilizing new building materials. The big one is titanium, which Frank Gehry used in his Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, Spain. So I'll touch on that. And then you have this polarizing effect of buildings kind of harmonizing with their surroundings. An example would be Falling Water from last chapter, or completely standing out from the surroundings and being completely new and different. And the Guggenheim in Bilbao is a perfect example of that. So I will now transition to that building. Gehry is classified as a deconstructivist, which you all figured that out when you did your homework the other night. And his museum in Bilbao, Spain, is a perfect example of deconstructivism. It is, and the way that the text describes his creative process is he'll make a model of a building and then he'll take it apart. And he'll take it into all these different pieces and then he'll rearrange the pieces. So what he ends up with is this very piecey, asymmetrical, organic looking sculpture that eventually somehow turns into a futuristic looking building. So this is his design for the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, Spain. Do not get this confused with the Guggenheim Museum in New York City, which we are all familiar with. That was actually designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, our other buddy that we studied last chapter. So don't get those two confused. And this is very futuristic looking. It's made of titanium. which, as I said, is a new building material. It's this very durable, very shiny metal that allowed him to create all of these very organic, curved surfaces on the building. Okay, I realize that I need to get moving along here, girls, because we have a lot more to cover. So I need to talk to you a little bit about Zaha Hadid's Maxi Museum in Rome, Italy. I did look it up, and it is Maxi Museum, unless the Khan Academy people are wrong, which I'm not going to assume they are. This was completed in 2009, and Zaha Hadid is known internationally for being one of the greatest postmodern architects. She's won many awards, and this is, some art scholars would say that this is her greatest work. The other interesting thing about her is that she died recently. She died in March, unfortunately. So that is another reason why we, this new appreciation of her work has come about. So it's an art museum. It's in Rome. It contains contemporary art. And if you have time, definitely watch the video on Khan Academy to learn a little bit more about the museum and to see the inside of it. But I think transitioning from Gary's Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao to this museum provides an interesting contrast. So what similarities do you see? What differences do you see between the Guggenheim and the Maxi Museum? Well, hopefully you're thinking about the organic curvilinear surfaces of both of the museums. However, this is made mostly of concrete. She is influenced by a number of different things. So I have these for you in this slide. So she's influenced by modern architects such as Le Corbusier. Remember me saying that you see a lot of similarities between Villa Savoy and the Maxi Museum, particularly with these long, slender columns and this piece kind of jutting out, these simple forms kind of jutting out. We had that same kind of design going on in Villa Savoy. You also see some curvilinear shapes. Remember this? We studied this a long time ago, this snail shell minaret from one of the Islamic mosques that we studied. So she, as an Iraqi artist, she was born in Iraq but studied in England, probably saw a lot of these mosques, and so it's not a surprise that she's influenced by the architecture that she grew up seeing. I also have some ancient Roman arches and some more Baroque architecture. So all of these different styles of architecture are influencing her. And here's another view of the Maxi Museum. So you can see it's very curvilinear. There's a lot of movement. It has this sort of piecey quality that the Guggenheim Museum also possesses. However, this is not considered deconstructivist architecture like the Guggenheim is. I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about house in Newcastle County, but you can read about this on your own. And I do want to point out that it is a house. The function of it was a house for a private couple living in Delaware. And what characteristics here do you see from the list that I just gave you for postmodern architecture? Hopefully you're thinking of the lack of symmetry. Okay, so it's a very asymmetrical building. The incorporation of a lot of windows. Okay, so we have a lot of windows going on. And just, like I said, borrowing from the past, but putting their own spin on it. So you'd never see something like this, say, like in the Renaissance, where everything was completely rational, everything was completely symmetrical. This, a sense of asymmetry was completely unheard of back in the Renaissance. So I'm realizing I'm running out of time, so I'm going to quickly end with this drawing by Kiki Smith, who's the daughter of Tony Smith, who's a minimalist sculptor. Her work deals with feminist themes, religious themes, mythical narratives, and this specific drawing deals with this juxtaposition between the nude female body and this sort of violent, wild beast. So with that being said, I'm going to make another podcast, so I will see